Welcome.
That's right.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming to Chesterwood, the home, studio, and gardens of Daniel Chester French. This is a place that inspired some of his greatest work, and it continues to inspire artists today, which is one of the reasons we're here to celebrate the work of Ron Mehlman. My name is Michael Lynch. If you've seen me up here before, I was wearing a different hat. I was the former chair of the advisory council for Chesterwood. They roped me into being the interim director for the summer to help out with the staff here who have planned an action-packed season of events. They need an extra pair of hands, so I'm the extra pair of hands. Stepping into my role as chair of the advisory council is Nancy Mills. Nancy, if you would just stand up to be recognized. Thank you, Nancy. I want to make 3 acknowledgments. First, as I said, this is the site that inspired Daniel Chester French and artists today, but it inspired people before Europeans settled in this area. Chesterwood resides on the ancestral homes of the Mohegan Nation, which once stretched from the Hudson River Valley to western Massachusetts, Connecticut, and southern Vermont. These people of the waters that are never still were forced from this land in the late 1700s by the European settlers who moved west from the Boston area. Today, that community is known as the Stockbridge Munsee Community Band of the Mohegan Indians, and they live on federally subsidized lands in Wisconsin. If you go to chesterwood.org, there is a land acknowledgement statement, and if you want to know more about the Stockbridge Munsee, there is a link to their website where you can learn about their current day activities in Wisconsin and their connection back here to the Stockbridge area. So it is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, creating, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of these Mohegan people. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we dedicate our resources and privileges to building a more inclusive, equitable, and respectful place for all peoples. The other acknowledgement is that this is the 45th year of outdoor sculpture at Chesterwood. I haven't been here for all 45 of those years, but I have been here for many of them. And one of the things that we like to celebrate is that Lillian Heller was a sculptress who came to sculpture late in her life and established a foundation to support the outdoor sculpture exhibits here at Chesterwood. So this annual contemporary sculpture exhibit is generally supported by a grant from the Lillian Heller Sculpture Endowment. Her daughter-in-law is our neighbor. She lives, I won't point out her house, she lives near here. And so we're very appreciative of the fact that every year they provide a stipend to support the work of the contemporary sculptor. And the final acknowledgement I would like to make is for the staff here at Chesterwood. I started here on Monday. So I have stepped into this wonderful, well-oiled machine that has planned a full season of events. And the person who has handled all of that is Margaret, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank her publicly for all her work. And to introduce Margaret because she's going to introduce the program.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome to the opening of the 45th Annual Contemporary Sculpture at Chesterwood exhibition. My name is Margaret Sharon, and I have had the honor of serving as interim executive director for the past year, which means I've had the pleasure of working with our guest curator and our artists for the past 6 months. As many of you know, Chesterwood has long had a tradition of promoting contemporary art, just as Daniel Chester French would have done in his day. And to date, this landscape has exhibited the work of over 600 contemporary artists. There have been juried group shows and curated group shows, but I've noticed that when we showcase one artist, it allows the curator to tell a more cohesive story, the artist an opportunity to reconsider his work in the context of the Chesterwood landscape, and the viewer a more intimate experience with the artist as moving from piece to piece reveals a little bit more about the artist's soul. Our featured artist this year is Ron Mehlman, originally from Brooklyn, but who primarily makes his home in Pietrasanta, Italy. To be close to the renowned marble and stone quarries, that provide him with the materials and inspiration to make his art. What became very clear to me the moment I met Ron is that he surrounds himself with an incredible team. Not least of all, his amazing wife, Janice. Yes, please give her an applause. Whose passion and energy and kindness led to the successful fruition of this exhibition. Our guest curator this year is Michele Cohen, who has the coolest job title in the world. She is the curator for the architect of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., where she oversees a vast collection of paintings and sculpture, including one Lewis cast by our own Daniel Chester French, located in the National Statuary Hall. Michele has long been an advocate for public sculpture and has written and taught extensively about it, and I'm very grateful to her for bringing the beautiful work of Ron Mehlman to Chesterwood. Lastly, I want to thank the incredible team, like Michael did, the incredible team at Chesterwood that supported this exhibition, my colleagues Karen Kinney and Dana Pilson, and as well as Jerry Blash and Ben Parrott, who worked tirelessly with Ron and Janice and their team for the past 2 weeks to bring this exhibition to fruition. So without further ado, I'm going to leave you to a conversation between the curator and the artist, and we welcome your questions at the end. And there's a reception afterwards behind the barn, where there's more of Ron's work to be seen in the Woodland Gallery. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Margaret, for such a gracious introduction. This has truly been a pleasure for me, a personal pleasure. It's been an opportunity for me to really reconnect with an artist that I met almost 40 years ago. We were babies then. Back in Brooklyn when I was writing a guide to Manhattan's outdoor sculpture. And just right around that same time, the mid-'80s, Ron had completed a piece called Water Trilogy that is located in Manhattan on one of those kind of like vest pocket parks. What's the address of it? 50?
It's a 51st Street.
Oh.
Sorry, you all listening? It was 51st Street between Park and Madison.
And I remember looking at that piece, and at the time I really didn't know a lot about Ron, his work, and I had not met him personally. And I was really struck when I encountered Water Trilogy, and I was struck by how he so successfully wedded granite and glass with light and water to create a sculpture that was both timeless and fleeting. So it was this synthesis of opposites that really kind of mesmerized me. And even more at night, it took on like a whole nother personality where the center became this cascade of liquid light. And I was really fascinated that this could happen in a public space. And it was using the built environment, but to create a really human place that would attract viewers and almost contemplative in Midtown Manhattan, which is very hard to do. Fast forward to today, and Ron's work has really evolved since then in many ways, and we'll see that as we talk about the work. But I was really trying to think about what is that essential quality that still draws me so much to this work that really spans decades. And it's what I call finding the center, which is the title of the exhibition. And I think that when you stand and really contemplate Ron's work, the inherent interlocking parts that are clearly balanced in some sort of like almost like intuitive engineering, me as the viewer, they also center. So for me, it's like finding that space. And it's like, think about almost like a yoga pose where you're doing a tree pose. I have that sort of feeling when I'm interacting with Ron's pieces. So our goal today is to talk about them and for you really to get to know the artist, because that's a rare privilege. So often we see art in a museum or gallery and you're relating to the work, but you don't often get to hear this person behind the work. So that's the goal really of our conversation. And we very much want to encourage questions. So if you do have anything that's on your mind, we'll get to it. So Ron, did you want to say a few words before we started?
Yes, thank you. I would like to thank all, closer?
Yeah, just a little closer. It's hard
Oh,
to hear.
was I? Okay.
I didn't think we were becoming that intimate yet. So, I would like to, when I was invited here, I knew what to expect because I had been here 20 years ago in another exhibition, in a group exhibition. And it was a wonderful thing, except I wasn't here. I was in Italy. And everyone told me how beautiful this event was. So to be here as the solo artist in a group in this tradition it's just fantastic to see that studio and to be in it is to absorb hundreds of years of culture. I just love that idea. Before I begin, by the way, if anyone sees my wife making hand gestures, like that's because she's doing things like this. Too much. I have a whole system we have a system that no one else can tell what it is. So I have another. So I was forced to join it. I was forced to join an organization like Alcoholics Anonymous. It was called On and On and On. So that I would curtail my abuse of the language. I would like to thank the staff from this organization, which was my group. We came here with sculpture movers, my assistant, Pop. Where is he? There he is, on the ground here, taking pictures. A man who has entered my head and can put together my sculptures better than I can now. And it's wonderful to have him on board. And then to have, so let's give a hand. And this staff, my staff, just worked so beautifully with the staff ongoing here. They're like, in Italy, we have a bunch of people in our neighborhood called artisans. People come from all over the world to work with these artisans who are the best carvers and finishers and polishers of marble sculpture in the world. Here, I walk into this situation. We have a sculpture that needs water. It was designed as a fountain, but I never spent enough time working out the details. So I asked one of the staff, if you can help me make this detail. And boom, he focused, this guy Jerry, focused on this and put together this fountain, which I had conceptualized, but never realized until we had this today. So as you walked in and you entered, you saw that fountain. The problem was that as people passed by and you walked in to pay for the fee or whatever, the problem was it's a slow trickle. So a lot of people were rushing to the bathroom immediately. Anyway, I would like to thank her staff. This project, putting this together, was an enormous and heavy. You can imagine how much these things weigh by themselves. Without my wife, this would have been virtually impossible. She guided me, she kept me on focus, she kept me going. So I would just like to say, without her, the curator who had interviewed me how many years ago? 40 years ago.
Almost 40.
40 years
Almost
ago.
40.
And she's still a kid. How did that happen? And so she interviewed me for the book she was doing on Manhattan's outdoor sculpture. And that idea, I just want to say, that idea, because Manhattan was a fountain. I was commissioned to do a fountain. It ended up being a 35-ton fountain. But you can't have water in New York City in the winter because it freezes, and it would break this 35-ton granite sculpture apart. So I use glass and light instead of water in the winter. So if you walk around and see the sculpture now, you could see pieces of glass as a unit, as part of the sculpture. It all came from that design. And the first person to really study it and think about it was our curator, Michele Cohen. So I want to thank her so much for making it. Okay, I'm ready. She promised she'd be easy on me.
So we all wonder about an artist. How do they get their ideas? And so my first question to you, Ron, is what are your sources of inspiration?
It's not an easy answer because every day is different and every day is a challenge. But you know, one has a way of working and one develops certain skills and one doesn't want to lose those skills. So one wants to work with those skills and then develop a way of seeing that maybe is unique to the artist. And then when every day is different and the world changes and politics change and everything changes, your finances change. Sometimes it's good. So I don't have to tell you, we're all in the same boat. But the thing is that if you keep the boat going, the canoe going in the same direction, and then if you can veer off course, maybe another idea will come, maybe you'll come back and keep going. But so the inspiration, it doesn't come from up above or down below, but it does come from tradition. That's an interesting, I'm thinking this out as I'm talking to you. It does come from tradition. And maybe that's why I love to be and walked into that studio and watched that tradition. And you see the thing that impresses me is there's a cabinet of his tools. And you go into those tools and I could look at those and touch them and see how we use them. It's really the same tools that we've been using in Italy. I live in Italy part of the year. It's the same tools for 500-600 years. They haven't changed. The quality of the metal is better, but really the shapes and the way of thinking and working is basically the same. So I just walk into that studio and I receive a glow. I receive a glow from that. The interim director is giving this, is telling me that I have to keep moving. So I'm sorry.
So following along those lines, this idea of sources of inspiration, when you look at your sculpture, I think most people wonder, well, how did you actually make it? And do you sketch out an idea ahead of time? Do you build a maquette? Do you survey the materials you have in your studio and do those lead you to a solution? So what is how really do you go about building them? And I'm assuming the answer is different depending on the piece. So maybe you want to describe a piece that we're looking at, how you built it.
Which piece are we looking at?
Well, I'm with that one.
Okay. Now, that piece is made of two different kinds of marble. They're really not marble. They're hard stone. One of the stones, the green stuff, is from Switzerland. The red stuff, which is called rosso rubino, is from Italy, and it's a very special, beautiful red stone. I think these two colors go so well together, and the textures and patterns go so well together. Before I even started the sculpture, so I looked at that piece and those pieces, and I said, I'll bet I could do something with these two stones without using another stone. So that comes from the idea that, gee, how much do I use the red stone? How much do I use the green stone? How do I do this? Do I carve them or do I cut them with a saw? So all of these parts of studio life become part of my dream to make this piece. This was done with flat slabs of red stone, that red Rosso Rubino, and the green stone from Switzerland, and then cutting them with diamond saws, and then carefully shaping them and polishing them. So then you can ask me, how long does it take to make a piece like that? Looks so simple, maybe 4 or 5 weeks of constant work. So it's not, and then the part of it that's less interesting is people walk over and they say, I don't like it. Yeah. Or, I love it. How much is it? Too much. So that's why it's still here.
Well, a lot of your pieces look almost as if it's like a stone jigsaw puzzle. Especially that one, I'd say, really illustrates that. But how are you physically able to make the parts stand? Like, what is the engineering behind it?
You are talking to a person who is not very good in mathematics. And but in front of the drawing board and working things out on paper is pretty interesting to me. So how it's engineered is me sitting quietly in my studio, maybe a little music in the background, and me quietly over a long period of time working out the mathematics of it.
So did you ever come to build a sculpture and it kind of fell down?
Yes. I told you in advance about my problems with mathematics. They didn't deal with weight necessarily, but it didn't matter. One time, my wife and I were standing in front of I have a nice place in Italy. It's kind of like this, not as grand, mind you, but it's kind of like this, looking down at my sculpture yard. And a big storm was coming. So Janice calls to me, Ron, there's a storm coming, you gotta come here, we gotta move these pieces, we're gonna lose them. I said, no, they're heavy. We're standing on the front of my house, just like this on the deck, looking down, and sure enough, a wind comes in. This sculpture must have been 600-800 pounds, lifts it vertically up.
Whoa.
And throws it down. And Janice says, what did it say? See? Yes, I've lost a number.
But I do want to assure everyone, all the pieces in this show are well secured.
There's no storm coming? No, so not a hurricane.
So one of the sculptural mediums that I think you use, I would describe as light and air. And the question here is, how would you describe your work in relation to the landscape?
I try when I'm designing a sculpture that it was not a solid block or thing in the center. It encompasses in the old days, we used to call it the negative space, the shapes around the space. So that if I was standing here and I had my hands at my side, and more or less like one of the Lincolns here that was done by our master, and he would be standing looking forward, doesn't take much air around it. It's all in the volume is all in the torso. But if one leans forward slightly, moves an arm out, curves the arm, goes into a form where one hip is carrying the weight of the other, all of a sudden the air around the sculpture becomes part of the sculpture. So it's not like it's a solid one piece monolith. That's the word. It's a monolith. It becomes another thing. So I try to, with these pieces, I try to encompass as much of the outside, as much as the outside as possible. Is that fair?
That's fair. And how, I mean, light animates your work in such magical ways. And I mean, we're all fortunate to be here today toward the afternoon light, which I really think it provides this glow, this inner glow. So how did you come to start thinning stone so it becomes so translucent?
Well, first I start with the stones that have the potential to be translucent. So for instance, white marble, not necessarily the marble that France used, because that's a very dense marble. But I'm talking the marble of, let's say, of Italy, where the marble is so translucent, so hard, that if you shine a light on it, you can see the marble absorbing the light. And if it were carved thin enough, it would be almost translucent. So I try to find stones that are almost translucent. Here, this stone is a yellow stone. It's an onyx. The name of the stone is onyx. It's not the light stone. What is the other stone that?
Alabaster.
Alabaster that you can probably do with your teeth. You know, it's very soft. But this stuff is really hard. It's as hard as marble. And if you work it thin enough, it becomes translucent. Here, in this piece here, for instance, of light going through it, I added color. I painted the sculpture. Oh my God. He took a beautiful piece of white marble and he painted it. I'm sitting here with a famous art historian. She knows that all the Greek sculptures were painted. She knows that the Elgin marbles, famous Elgin marbles, were painted. The idea of having pure white marble was such that that the Elgin marbles, when Lord Elgin rescued the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon, and he did rescue them because the Greeks were fighting with if you remember, some of you remember, the Greeks were fighting with the
Turks.
with the Turks, and and they said, look at this beautiful big space. No one's going to destroy this big space. Let's use it as an ammunition dump. Good idea. So the Greeks loaded all their ammunition into the Parthenon. Great. The Turks said, aha, we don't like that art anyway. We do a different kind. Let's just lob a shell into it. They lobbed a shell, blew the place apart. Now, most of us don't know that. So now we have the Elgin marbles, which are falling off the facade of this thing. Lord Elgin comes in. I, Lord Elgin, will save these marbles, and he will take them. If I offend anybody, please leave. My wife just gave me signal to
Wrap it up.
Wait a minute. Where was I?
We're talking about Lord Elgin and the
Oh yeah, so recently I'm reading the paper, and here the Elgin, to send them back, the British want to send them back in their original state. So they noticed there were stains on some of these three pieces of the Elgin marbles. So in their mind, They got some restorers, they got some sandpaper, and they sanded the surface off the Elgin marbles to make it pure white. They were never pure white. They were painted.
Okay.
So this is the good question. Sorry. I told you about that organization I belong to. And on. It's true. This is.
So, another question has to do with architecture. And we talked about painting, your relationship of your work to painting.
Yeah.
But I think also that there's a very strong relationship with architecture, the language of architecture, the way that buildings even are designed. Would you care to expound on that?
In order to respond to that, I would have to ask you to look at some of these pieces carefully, because a lot of them, even from this view, down on the left side on there, and down over here, there are two pieces which are super architectural, and they feel like architecture, and they could be designed into a structure like architecture. So architecture is very important as an element in my. It has become a very. I didn't start that way,
Right.
but it has become a very important element.
Right. In fact, Ron's earliest work was really in wood, right?
Yeah.
You carved wood.
I was a carver.
So you had a very different approach to sculpting. It was about subtraction, and you were working in a very different material.
Yes.
And then, how has living and working in Pietrasanta changed your work and also the trajectory of your career?
Well, one works with the material that one has at hand. When I was in New York and working as a sculptor, I loved the idea of carving. The idea of carving is you take a volume, like this tree, this fantastic tree, cut it off at the base. That is terrible for the tree, but great for the sculptor. So could you cut it off, and then you have a big block of wood. So then I would look at that and say, what can I do with this after buying this tree trunk? I used to go, there was a place in Woodstock on the other side of the river. You all know that side of the river. So I would buy a log, put it in my studio or in a neighborhood, and then start carving it. And so that with the volume would be to the right side, I can go no further. To the left side, you don't go any further. Front and back, you'd carve in, and that would be the total of the sculpture. With additive sculpture, I could take a piece here, a piece there, put them together, glue them together, pin them together, and it becomes, I can go out to the left as far as I want, I can go to the right as far as I want, and so far the front and back. So it's a completely different way of thinking. But when I went to Italy, I didn't want to carve blocks of marble, which they're still doing beautifully in Italy. That's what they do there. So I said, how can I use stone and not use even white marble and not use it in a way that all the other artists from all over the world do? How can I do something a little different? So I started taking pieces of stone and adding them together and cutting them and making them fit and slide, kind of like a wood carpenter might do with fitting joints together and putting things together. So these things would become volumes instead of just from the tree.
And now we're toward the end of my questions, because I really do want to open this up to the audience. I think we actually had, okay, my one last question, which is if you have an opportunity, I hope we all do, to go to the gallery space, you'll see some smaller works there on the wall, and you'll also see some metal sculptures. And when I saw those in Ron's studio, I was really attracted to them. I said, how fantastic. Look what you're doing with the tools of traditional sculpture. You're working with metal calipers and chisels and all the sorts of pointing tools that are used still in Pietrasanta to translate something from a clay to a plaster to a marble. Ron has used them in this sort of creating these assemblages. And in addition, he has a series of wall pieces which are really delightful, which combine this sort of assemblages and also constructions and also somewhat autobiographical. So I think my last question would be, would you talk a little bit about some of the smaller pieces? Are they, I think you had mentioned to me, you started thinking of them more as sketches, but they truly are complete works onto themselves. And I guess the question is too, I'm not sure when you started doing those, and I guess you've continued to do them over many years. It's sort of like your sketchbook.
And they're so much fun to do. And thank you for that question. And it's true, those wall pieces started out as sketches. Need some ideas. I don't have a lot of material around. I have cut-offs from my studio. I have things happening all around me, pieces of things in my studio. Some parts wood, some parts plaster, some things I've collected from a Greek head that had fallen, a plaster, of course, fallen off the wall and it kind of broke in an interesting way. I kept all those parts and I started making small little sketches, some not this size.
Oh, and here's the
there's
catalog. I
turn
meant
to
to
back.
show you that.
This is a wall of them. And so I started making small ones. They became a lot of fun to do. And so I one, then I had two, then I had three, and I used this material and that material. I used an old tool. I used a sculpture, maybe a sculpture from one of my students that was fantastic. And the kid said, I don't like it. I took it. So that, so I used all of these things for sketches from my future work. And then it developed into 10, 15, 20, 30. I started putting them on the wall. And, these are pretty damn interesting. And the spaces between them are pretty damn interesting as well. So I could put these things on the wall and put the piece next to it and put them close enough so there's a relationship between the two. And then all of a sudden, a wall started to come together. And before long, I had 30 pieces, and then 60. And then it was so much fun that, I was, what about the big sculpture? Yeah, but you have to finish these little babies. Anyway, they were a lot of fun, and I continued working on them for a long time.
And I think what fascinates me about them is they're so effective in this very small, intimate scale, but I could easily envision them being much larger as well.
But if I made them much larger in this kind of thing, it wouldn't feel the same. It wouldn't be as playful.
Right, they're very playful.
Yeah.
It
wouldn't be as much fun.
your personality really comes through. I think all the time it comes through. But like the small pieces, because there's somewhat, there's more personal references in them, and they are quite witty. And
thank you. There are some pieces in the show over here where my first successful sculpture was done in wood, and it was I had invested in a piece of ebony. I think it was 60 cents for this piece of ebony. And I took the ebony and I made a figure out of it. And then I got a bigger piece of ebony and I made a double figure out of it. And when I came to New York, my teacher at the Art Students League, Nat Cass, saw these two old pieces and he said, "How much do you want for that?" And I said, "You could sell these." and I said, so it was a revelation. Maybe this is a way of going through life. You can be an artist, have fun, and make sculpture, and people would like it. It never occurred to me that other people would like it. My mother seemed to like it at the beginning. But when I said, I'm very serious about this, she said, maybe something else would be more interesting. So,
well, I'm glad that you didn't listen to your mother. So I think maybe now we'll open it up for questions. Does anyone have anything? Yes.
When you look at your sculptures, there's two sides to them. What's your favorite side?
There's not two.
At least two. Yeah.
My favorite side is my favorite side. I do have a favorite side. Yesterday, it was a minor argument between my wife and myself as to what favorite side this piece over here would be. And she won. That's why I'm married for so long.
Yes.
In this collection, which was the most challenging and why?
Challenging to disassemble and reassemble, or
Whatever the challenge is for him. You know,
well, Ron,
make it-
of all which piece here would you describe as the most challenging, either to disassemble and reassemble, or how you conceptualized it?
It's because it's different. They're different, and they materialize in different ways. I think one of my most successful sculptures, let's take that, which didn't start out that way, is this one down here, down at this, as these people are walking toward it. That piece. That piece is white marble, gorgeous white Italian marble, carved and then painted with another design over the top. With the design over the top, it's a heck of a lot more successful to me than what I started with as just a white sculpture. So that is a challenge which I accepted and worked on over a long period of time to make successful.
Yep.
Ron, you seem very focused on a particular project. Do you ever do multiple projects at the same time?
Yes. So I'm not committed, when I make one sculpture, I'm not committed to doing that till the very end. Sometimes I hit a roadblock. I'll stop, start something new, and then then go back to the first, hopefully with a better answer than what I started with. So I'm flexible. I move in and out. I also see things while I'm doing one sculpture, and I'll see a challenge over on the other area, and I'll say, that's a possibility. I don't think I ever worked that way, and with those materials, maybe I'll stop and consider that as a way of working. So I'll stop a project and begin and I could be off the wall and stop and go on, but at least I leave myself open to new possibilities.
Yes.
How do you sketch out, design something on paper? You begin to fabric. You stay strictly to that design, or the mistake, or fracture in the stone, or let it evolve?
I didn't hear
So
completely.
when the work starts, when you start on something on paper and you've worked it out on paper and then you begin to execute it, does it change in the execution from what
While you're fabricating,
Good question.
you make a mistake and then incorporate that and a little change, does the piece evolve?
So is there an evolution of as you're making it, is the work evolving?
Excellent question, because it's being asked by a wood craftsman who's an excellent carpenter. And so he knows that if you make an error, you make an adjustment around the error. Sometimes you don't tell but you work around the area, or you throw it out and start from scratch and recomplete the beginning. But I do it because as you work on paper, other ideas start developing as you develop the work. So you want to use it. You want to keep as fresh as possible. The idea of being an artist is that if you, the tradition once says if you lift heavy loads and move things from here to there, you're a laborer. If you can make a beautiful thing, from pieces of wood, you're a craftsman. If you use your heart and do the same thing that the craftsman does, you become an artist. So leaving that potential open for the future is, we're much longer. We're going on and on.
That on and on problem.
So,
So I guess
So-
that,
okay.
Hey, Ron, I got a question for you.
all right, the last
Uh-oh.
question.
Okay? How do you have two studios. How did, not recently, before COVID, how did you manage the both studios? How did you think through, moving from Brooklyn, what you were doing in Brooklyn, and move to Pietrasanta and do the work in Pietrasanta? How did they influence each other, or they challenge each other? Was it
The work in Italy, I never would have conceived of doing it when I was just in Brooklyn. But when I moved to Pietrasanta and started thinking in terms of that material, which was available to me, it opened up new doors. When I came back to Brooklyn, I wasn't just stuck with what I was before. I brought stuff back. I shipped stuff back. I kept things in my studio. I kept a pile of stones that I could pick at, and not like in Italy, but I something like it. So I try to keep my mind fresh. But the truth is that in Italy, the world is open to me because of the way I'm working now. I don't have all these gorgeous materials just available on a daily basis here. Even though you can go to the stone shop, and get a few, what do people buy, countertops. Buy a few countertops at great expense and make some sculpture out of them. But it's not the same.
Oh, wait, one more question? Okay, what?
Could you talk about the tensile strength of stone and how you discovered how you use it?
The tensile, I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Tensile strength.
How to use the strength of the stone.
Yeah, the tensile
So,
strength.
yeah.
I don't know.
If you would have been here while I was installing last week, then you would have seen. Me. Don't step on that. Easy with that piece of stone, please. Because if I'm using a 2-centimeter piece of stone, and on grand scale, I can break it with my heel, just like that. So it's just experimenting. It's just using this, having all the accidents, anticipating the accidents, and so forth. But that's how you discover the tensile material, the strength of the material.
So
I
Margaret?
hope that was a good answer. I don't know.
Yes, it was, and
Thank you.
thank you.